I want to give our presenter kudos for making it through the rain, the wind, the storm to come here. I never met a UF professor who so badly wanted to be here live. Um, but we're really glad to have Ken with us today. I would like to know how many of you know about the Center for Humanities and the Public Sphere. If you know about it, raise your hand or indicate that you know about it in some way.
They're shaking their heads here in the open room. Do not know.
Okay. I figured as much. So I want to tell you a little bit about the center. It is incredibly well respected at UF. It was founded in 2005 and started in 2009. And it's part of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at UF. It's directed by Barbara Mendel, who is incredible in terms of her scope of knowledge. She will be giving her own presentation during this course, and it's certainly going to be worth listening to and attending. Barbara is an associate professor, I think is an associate professor of English and German at UF. And just to tell you a little bit about the center, it has three very interrelated subjects. One is to facilitate and promote the research programs of humanities scholars at UF. The second is to provide an intellectual space and a physical location within the university and the College of Liberal Arts for critical and collaborative discussions of the humanities that reach across and beyond individual disciplines. So there's a collaboration among the members of the humanities and the public sphere, or like Ken, who's sort of like a associate member, I would say. And then the third is to provide a place for outreach to the community in which we live and teach. Ergo, one of the reasons we're here today. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Ken. Besides the fact that he braved the storm to come here. Well, before I do that, let me tell you a little bit about this program, because Barbara and I together came up with this title, Legacy of Violence. As you all know, we did a program on our legacy and where we're going and what we need to improve in the winter semester. I forget, we're now in the summer semester. But the legacy of violence is intended to analyze the effects of violence in the national context. Our presentations analyze how forces against Native Americans shape landscapes and how power relations define maps of the Mexican-US border. Speakers are going to address the legacy of American police brutality and silent cinema's portrayal of racial violence. And the cinema presentation will be done by Barbara. After a discussion of the tyranny in classes, Athens, the course concludes by reflecting on the changes, views on the changing views on the Bolshevik Revolution. The course offers diverse humanities perspectives on aggression in history and culture. So that is the purpose of the course. Ken Sassaman is a professor of archaeology in the Department of Anthropology at UF. He's an archaeologist with specialties in the archaic and woodland periods of the American Southeast, technological changes in community patterning, and since arriving in Florida in 1998, he has spent most summers in the middle of the St. Johns River Valley of Northeast Florida, where field schools have been directed towards the study of the region's oldest shelf minerals. And he's done a lot of work with high school students in that valley, and they love the experience. In 2009, he launched a Lower Swanee archaeology survey on the northern Gulf coast of Florida. The purpose was to investigate a record of maritime living that continued to be diminished by rising seas. His latest co-authored book is The Archaeology of Ancient North America. And with that introduction, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Ken. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ellen. Well, good afternoon. And thanks for that nice introduction, Ellen. I am very pleased to be the inaugural speaker for this wonderful series. When Barbara and Ellen asked me to contribute, I didn't hesitate. And I was actually quite impressed that the Okamic population was willing to take on such difficult subject, a subject of obviously great importance these days, and the historical context for that needs to be well understood. I think of this in the context of critical race theory debates these days, how there's a need for reconciliation, but we're not going to have that without the truth. So we have to look behind the curtain and see this past that's been hidden for so long. I think I go to share screen first to make this possible. And I'm going to share this screen, okay? And I'm sharing that. And then I can do this. Right? Okay, all right. Thank you, Julianne. Okay. So to kick off this series, I'm here to talk about what I call landscape structural violence with regard to the dispossession of Native American land, but I think more broadly that it's the dispossession of Native American history. And I'll explain that because I think the history and the land are inextricably linked for many reasons that we don't need to get into right now. But it's important that we look at this not just as the violent impacts that European colonialism had on Native North America with regard to people and their culture, their languages, and so forth, but also the land itself, land that was occupied from coast to coast, from the Arctic all the way down to the Isthmus of Panama, and of course into South America as well. So after about 15,000 years of dwelling in the Western Hemisphere, the indigenous people of North and South America had to confront the forces of Western colonization in a way that nearly erased them from the face of the earth. And the violent circumstances of this, apropos the subject of this series, they're pretty well known to us from first contact. We know historically much about things like the impact of disease on Native North American populations. We also know a good bit about the conflicts that ensued between first encounters and Native peoples. The skirmishes, I wouldn't call it necessarily warfare in those early days, but the local skirmishes that ensued. We also, of course, know that as settlers moved into the area and started to establish the first cities and the first towns, there was a great bit of displacement, modification of the landscape, and so forth. We also have pretty good histories of efforts of assimilation or enculturation that were at first localized, but then became pretty widespread, pushed primarily through organized religion, through Christian churches and the mission system, but also by governments that were making the effort to create citizens out of Native North American people. Citizens in their own guise, right? People that would blend in, that would be enculturated or assimilated within mainstream America. Now, those early efforts, of course, are scattered. They're not necessarily connected, despite the fact that it was all within the context of European colonization. And we certainly have good reason to look deeply into that aspect of the history. But here I want to focus on the dispossession of native land from the time of what's called settler colonialism. And that would be the time when the US emerges as a nation, an independent nation, and began to promulgate law and policy that would pave the way for the expansion of colonial settlers, both south into places like Florida, and then of course west across the Mississippi River after Louisiana Purchase in the early 19th century. So I'm interested in how those circumstances, the circumstances of settler colonialism, became structural, right? That's the topic here. Landscape, structural violence. The structural part of that term is how practices become codified in law that then perpetuate injustices in the guise of legalities, in the guise of order, in the guise of social good, right? And these are the things that are hidden behind even today. They're hard to see, but they can be exposed when you look at the history, right? This goes as well for, you know, what's being called critical race theory these days, that in order to really understand the injustices of race with regard to Black Americans, we need to delve really deeply into this past, back to the 1619 Project, the beginning of slavery. A similar sort of effort could be made for Native North America, but it hasn't quite yet. In fact, that was a subject of a Washington Post story this morning that one of our members here reminded me of, that we've never really come to grips with this, right? And we need to. It's a long time that we need to, right? Let me tell you quickly how I got involved with this. I'm an archaeologist, as Ellen said. I've been spending the last 40 years of my life digging into the earth with a shovel and with a trowel, looking for the traces of this ancient past that is not written down. As part of our problem in confronting Native American history is that much of it is non-literate, right? It exists only in material form. And I'll get back to that later because that's what I do. I'm not a historian, so I've never had a professional reason to delve very deeply into the archives or look at the ethnohistory of contact or the legalities of dispossession. None of those things have been necessarily on my agenda. But about this time last year, the president of the University of Florida gave me a call, and I was quite surprised. I had met him before. I took him out to the coast, President Fox. I took him to the coast, the Gulf Coast, to see some archaeological sites shortly after he arrived. And he remembered me, and I was very flattered that he did, because he has thousands of professors that he has to deal with every day, right? So he called and said, listen, I'm putting together a task force to look into UF's relationship to African-American and Native American peoples from an historical point of view. At the same time, he was putting together all these other groups that were delving into issues like the namings of buildings, issues of the racism behind the sports slogans or mascots or cheers. As you may know, they got rid of Gator bait for that reason. And all this, of course, was part of this great upswelling of concern following primarily George Floyd's murder, that we come to grips with our racial inequities and we try to build a better future based on better knowledge of this past and how we are situated in that stream, that great arc of history, right? So I immediately said yes, but I told him, I said, Lisa, I don't really know much about this. I know about archaeology. I can tell you about the laws protecting archaeological sites. I can tell you what's unjust about that. I can tell you what I consider to be the problems of the government dealing with the remains of Native North American peoples. But I do not have an historical background in this, but I accepted the opportunity and then I started reading. And boy, have I spent the last year opening up doors that I had never opened before, and being, in many respects, not shocked, but sobered, right? Just brought to my, to the fundamental knees of understanding that I'm a very privileged person in a privileged place who's been studying other people's past for a long time without necessarily their permission, right? I don't necessarily have an okay from Native American peoples to delve into their past. I'd like to think that I've done it well, and I've done it in a way that they would find beneficial to them. But we'll get back to that because that's part of the story here. But I have learned a lot, and I want to share what I've learned a little bit, but I also want to use this as an apology that I do not have the deep knowledge of all these historical details to perhaps answer all the questions that you might have about this. Now, here's the topics, and there's not that much time. There's a lot of topics here, so we're just going to touch on these briefly. Settler colonialism, as I mentioned, is kind of a unifying theme here. We'll take a look at the 1830s and the federal government's effort to remove Native American peoples from land east of the Mississippi across the river to the west. We'll take a look at land-grant universities. This was quite a surprise to me to find out that land-grant universities benefited from the dispossession of native land across the entire continent, not just where the universities are, but monies that were garnered from the sale of Indian lands nationwide, right? We'll take a look at the Dawes Act of 1887. That's land allotment of Indian reservations with the primary goal of breaking them up. Site destruction. Now we're into my purview. This is archaeological, how archaeological sites have been treated in the past and how they're treated in the present, and how we still have issues with that. Repatriation, also promulgated by federal law in 1990, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. We'll talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about how Native American peoples are now America's first climate refugees. And this is not just simply a matter of happenstance. It's an artifact or a consequence of settler colonialism and the displacement of Native people from their homelands. And then we'll end on a bright note that there is some hope for futures, especially with the new administration and the appointment of Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior. She's a Native American, and I hope that she'll bring a Native American agenda to the table. Let me talk briefly about this concept because you may not have heard this concept before. Neither did I until about 2 years ago. Oh, sorry. You know how to do it? I have the same problem in my classes. And by the way, the reason Ellen was surprised that I was so eager to be here is that I'm sick and tired of Zoom, right? So we've been doing it for so long. I was eager to get back to a classroom and speak to people face to face. It's the only way to roll, really. It's been great to have Zoom, but maybe it's time for us to get off of it, I hope. Okay, so this concept was novel, and it was actually coined by two lawyers, Seidelman and Howling, who wrote in 2019 in the flagship journal of American Archaeology called American Antiquity, that this concept would apply to the destruction of cemeteries in New Orleans. They were using this as case material to promote this kind of theoretic. Their argument was specifically about 3 cemeteries in New Orleans that were established in the late 19th century. They were some of the only below ground cemeteries. As you well know, New Orleans being below sea level puts their dead in mausoleums that are above ground, right? Because they can't really dig down into the ground. They'll hit water almost immediately. But before the turn of the last century, there were pauper graves and Black American graves in various places in New Orleans. And one in particular on which the school was built was raised. They took all the stones down and they covered it with sand and they built a school on top of it without any consultation of descendants of those buried in there. Now, their argument would be, well, we're going to build a school for Black kids, right? So this is all, you know, it all comes together. It's, you know, it's a way of like ameliorating the injustice of destroying the cemetery. But their argument is that, you know, there's something sacred, of course, about graves. Figured it out. Oh, somebody's unmuted. Keep your mute on if you're out there in Zoom world. Long story short, they coined this term to characterize something that was basically done legally, but clearly was beyond what they considered to be just, right? And something that needed to be redressed. So what I'm doing is I'm extrapolating this concept to the injustice that accrues from law that privileges property rights over human rights, and law that views land, and this goes all the way back, of course, to medieval times in the old world, law that views land as something that is an alienable commodity. It could be dissociated from persons, bought, sold, and traded, regulated, bounded, parsed out, you name it, right? That's fundamentally different than, say, a pre-medieval mindset, even in the old world, that land was, in fact, attached to persons in ways that made it inalienable, that you couldn't take it away. In fact, in the old estate systems in medieval Europe, even if a family moved away from their land, to the extent they could demonstrate descendancy, they could reoccupy that land without any question, right? So this is a legality that we take for granted. It's just, it permeates everything we know about property law, but it's something that runs in conflict with Native American sensibilities about land and their sovereignty over that, okay? Okay, our first topic, let's start with colonialism and settler colonialism. And I really don't want to dwell on the colonial part. I want to focus more on the settler colonialism. As I mentioned before, this is a concept that is one step removed from colonialism in the sense that we're now looking at down the road of early colonists, the establishment of nation states that now create laws, policy, regulations, and so forth that allow for the appropriation of land and the commodification of land, right? So one definition here from an expert on settler colonialism, and this is a theoretic that's now getting a lot of attention, but it's not accepted by all historians as being all that viable a concept. I think it is. Here's one definition, quote, settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that, over time, develops a distinctive ideology and sovereignty. So this is settler colonialism, unlike colonialism perhaps, is more structure than it is event. It ends up being an overarching system of laws, regulations, the apparatus of government, all the minutia that goes into property transfers, inheritance, deeds, liens, you name it, right? All that apparatus that defines property law, right? It becomes the structure in which now practice will operate, by which practice will operate. We could call it tradition too. And obviously, as Ellen knows, being a lawyer, law is subject to debate, revision, and that's certainly the case. Law is not codified. Law isn't set in stone. It's always in a state of becoming, I suppose. But this is one of those underlying kind of premises of Western colonists and Western colonialism, that land is in fact something that can be commodified. settler colonial societies throughout the world, not just in North America, not just the US, but Australia, South Africa, Canada, you name it, right? They tend to rely on very similar sorts of strategies and power structures. And one of those is this idea of terra nullius, N-U-L-L-I-U-S, terra nullius, Latin, right? Which means basically the perception that land in the long term used by indigenous people that is empty or underutilized is basically available for the taking, right? It's land that's open land. It's land that's free land. And we actually, if we look at the history of the first early contacts, we find the origins of the term like Indian giver, when Native North American people, say like the ones that, the Wampanoag, that were confronted by the Pilgrims in Plymouth, when land that they weren't using, open fields that were abandoned and left fallow, were then given to the colonists for use. From a Native point of view, that was simply sharing, and the use of the land was simply that, use, not ownership. But the people coming from Western Europe who had the mindset of property rights and ownership of property, they saw it the other way. And so when Native people came back and wanted to use that land, they would say, basically, you're being an Indian giver. You want something back that you've given to us. That basically kind of exemplifies what we're talking about here, right? So the expansion of early colonists into the settler colonial period, particularly in the 19th century, right? But starting in the 18th century. First south, then west. Primarily the foreground or the moving front of this were settlers that would just, what we call squatters, that would occupy land that wasn't necessarily theirs to take, nor was it necessarily acknowledged by the government as their right to occupy, but then under attack by Native peoples locally in places like Georgia with the Creek, North Carolina with the Cherokee, in Florida with the Seminole, who are in fact of Creek descent themselves, that they would appeal to governments for protection, right? We need defense, and then the government would be involved at that level. And those conflicts are well known to us, you know. They led to things like the First and Second Seminole Wars here in Florida. But beyond that, it's the legislation that's more interesting to me. The Armed Occupation Act of 1842, at the end of the Second Seminole War. If you were willing to take up arms to protect land that was given to you by the government, then take it. And that helped to remove Native peoples from places like northern Florida and then displace them down into South Florida, where the Seminole reside today, of course. The Homestead Act later of 1862, the allocation of lands west of the Mississippi, again, a lot of that, we'll come to this later, a lot of that was formerly Native land that was granted to Native tribes through treaty with the US. And I probably don't have to tell you that treaties with the US weren't worth the paper they were written on in most cases. The upshot here is creating a society of private property and ownership, including, if they could, a society of Native Americans who abided by private property and ownership law of the US, right? The trouble is that even with land allocated to Native peoples, whether it's the territories, or excuse me, the reservation system west of the Mississippi after the 1830s, or later with the Dawes Act, individual plots of land in the 1880s, late 1880s. Either way, neither one of those, none of those relationships with the US government provided for the same property rights that Euro-Americans had. I'll come back to that. Indian removal. This is not something in the 1830s that was new. We could say that Indian removal started when the Pilgrims arrived and they started just taking up land that was being occupied or used at least seasonally by Native people. So this is nothing new. The legislation written in 1830 and signed by Andrew Jackson was really, though, the major turning point, because that was the point when Indian removal became a federal government mission, that they would remove all Native peoples east of the Mississippi and get them out of the way of an expanding nation. So I just got finished reading this book by Claudio Sant, and I highly recommend it. It was a National Book Award finalist last year, 2020. It's not light reading. It's very sobering, poignant, but it's incredibly insightful. My knowledge of Indian removal up to this point was reading the relatively bland, objective account of Grant Foreman that was published, first half of the last century. And it was actually, it's really accurate, it's really detailed, but it doesn't have a point of view. But Claudio Sant's book does, and it's an important point of view. First of all, he says the term Indian removal is inappropriate. He doesn't like either one of those words. He doesn't use Indian, and a lot of white scholars do not, even though a lot of Native Americans continue to use that or are proud to use that, and rightfully so. But it has the connotation of primitiveness that is deeply embedded in our history. So he eschews that. He'd rather use Native American or indigenous people or native peoples. And certainly there's a big trend towards that. That's fine, leave that aside. It's the removal part that he really has a problem with for two reasons. Removal seems kind of passive, and it also doesn't specify who the agent of removal is. Is it the Indians removing themselves from a situation, or was it the government removing Indians from land that they wanted to open up to settlers, right? Well, it was clearly the latter. So what Claudio argues is that let's call it what it is, deportation. Deportation because it was state-sponsored, right? This isn't just a choice, but it ends up being law. It ends up being a huge program, an effort to remove people from their native lands and get them out of the way of settler colonialism. And then he also says we could call it what it is, it's expulsion. And that's where the violence comes in, because this wasn't done in a way that was equitable, fair, and just. It was done in the most egregiously unjust way, in a way that led to a tremendous amount of death and suffering and starvation. It was done during winters. And a lot of that they would explain was logistics of transporting people by water. Did you have sufficient water in navigable streams to get people from places of their homeland to the places where they would then be on reservations? That was one of the arguments. The other one would just be simply things like the bad, the insects and the heat and so forth. Well, the dead of winter and some of these efforts starting in the early 1830s happened to coincide with the particularly bad winters, really cold winters, lots of snow, lots of ice, and Native peoples weren't provided with much of anything. In fact, it was supposed to work that they were briefed on where they were going and educated about their homeland. In fact, emissaries would go and check out the new homeland, the reservations, come back, describe to people how it was going to happen, what it was going to be like. Then they were supposed to plan the trip with these stations along the way where they could be re-provisioned, get food, more clothes if they needed, spend the night in a shelter and so forth, and then ultimately arrive safe and sound. None of that happened. None of that happened. In fact, this is a great case of government privatization where they would just basically lend out contracts to these people who were supposed to do provisions, and they would just abscond with the money, right? They'd run off with the cash and not provide anything. Sounds familiar, right? We got stuff like that today. So the Louisiana Purchase really was a trigger for leading up this piece of legislation. And this is probably the best known part of deportation or removal, this 1830s Act, signed by Andrew Jackson. He was just chomping at the bit to get a hold of this. He had already spent, his early military career doing Indian removal in Georgia and Alabama and parts of Florida. So he was well prepared and had this on his agenda. This is the best known to us, but I would submit that actually Indian removal continues today, and it's going to continue into the future with the climate crises we have, primarily because we have lots of indigenous people in some of the most vulnerable places to things like sea level rise and global warming. So it will continue. Land-grant universities, next subject. This is the one that kind of surprised me. I naively, having no prior knowledge about how land-grant universities came to be, had always assumed that it meant that the land on which a land-grant university sits was deeded to them by the federal government. I didn't have any thoughts about where they got the land or who owned it before the universities took it over. So that's not it at all, right? Because the fact of the matter is, the University of Florida actually, we have to trace our history to Lakeland, the Florida Agricultural College, and then the East Seminary, south of here near Ocala. So the University of Florida really only came into existence in the early 20th century with an act of the state government to make Gainesville its home. And by then, Gainesville was already a Euro-American town, or an American town, I should say. There's certainly African-American people living here at that time as well. But it was not Indian land. It hadn't been Indian land since the Timucua, since the Spanish period, right? And the Seminoles were south of here, and they were basically, the last Seminole occupations would have been in the 1840s, early 1840s. Armed Occupation Act kind of like displaced those individuals to the south. And they did that by choice because, what we know about the Seminoles is that they're the only Indian nation that, quote unquote, was never conquered, right? They used evasiveness, mobility, and incredible cunning to evade the domination of the American state, right? So here's how it works, though. So land was basically acquired by the federal government and then given to states as scrip for them to sell on an open market to acquire money to establish their universities. So here's what the University of Florida, for instance, and by the way, you're looking at the output of this incredible study by two scholars published in High Country News in 2020 last year. They went through all the government records, mostly kept by the Bureau of Land Management these days, but you can go back into the 19th century and find the actual transactions of land secession between the federal government and Native Americans. They tallied up all the lands that were acquired, what was paid for them, how they were allocated to states as land grants, what the states did with them, with that land, how much money they got for it, and then ultimately what became of that. And the upshot here is that the University of Florida received scrip for 90,226 acres from 996 parcels of Indian land distributed across 120 tribes in 9 states, none of which were in Florida, of course, right? You can see where they are, Midwest, a lot from California. Many of these were done by ratified treaties, about 65%, but a bunch of them were also done by unratified treaties. And in one case, the University of Florida has land that was taken by the Washoe of California against their will, so forcibly taken from them. This didn't amount to much in terms of cash. It ended up being, and by the way, this was allocated based on population size. So Florida was at the bottom end of the scale. They got basically 90,000 acres, but other states like New York, manifold numbers of acres from that. But this amounted to basically, it was worth $80,000. It was sold to a broker by the name of Gleason Lewis out of Cleveland in one lot, sold all the parcels for 80 grand. They were invested in $100,000 worth of state bonds in 1874. That was the equivalent of $2.3 million today. Not a lot of money to run a university, but these were the fledgling years. And it was enough to hire the early staff and get some infrastructure in place. And thereafter, the rest is, of course, history. It's a hidden part of the history of the University of Florida. Relatively small potatoes compared to other schools. University of Georgia, for instance, had a much larger take in all this. And I think Cornell University up in New York is probably, or was it Syracuse? I'm sorry. One of those two up there was probably the biggest taker of all this. This is hidden history. The Dawes Act, 1887. This is the Land Allotment Act, and at face value, your average US citizen had already bought into this ideology that we could improve Indian lives by encouraging them to take up an American lifestyle and to follow the opportunities that were offered by the federal government for land, education, and so forth. You all know about the Indian schools. In fact, there's been in the news a lot lately because of these bodies that have been dug up at Canadian Indian schools, one in Kamloops and one in Saskatoon. These are they had parallels here in the US as well. That's okay. Uh-huh. So at face value, this was just part of an ongoing effort, a multifaceted effort to anglicize, to Americanize Native peoples. In this way, it was ultimately, the upshot was that it was a way of breaking up the reservation system and disintegrating the collectives that were known as tribes, right? How it worked was basically that the US government said, we'll give you a piece of the reservation as private property. You take this land, you work the land, you'll have a house, you'll have a farm, you'll have a stable, and you'll have independence, you'll have autonomy. What they didn't give them was property rights. They couldn't buy, sell, or trade it. They couldn't pass it down from generation to generation. And they also regulated what they could do on it. Like they weren't going to allow them certain economic opportunities, perhaps things like, making liquor, for instance, right? They're going to tell them what they can and cannot do. Though the bulk of it was actually not given to Indians, but after this Dawes Act was passed and the opportunities were made available, all what they called the excess land was then sold to anybody that had the money to buy it. And they were, of course, mostly more wealthy or some people with means east of the Mississippi of European descent, not of Native American descent. It was a lot. It was 100 million acres that was sold to non-white people. So here we have basically another step of land dispossession. After having removed Native American people from the east and moving them west of the Mississippi, taking reservations west of the Mississippi and busting them up into little pieces, all under the guise of improving Native lives and bringing them into the fold of American culture, American society. All right. Now, while all this is going on throughout this entire history of land dispossession, the allotment system, the land grant universities, all this land-based legislation, while all that's going on, there's an archaeological record out there from coast to coast, from the Arctic all the way down to the deserts. And it is a testament of an incredible 15,000 plus year history of Native American dwelling in North America. And in the eastern United States, particularly in the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley, but also here in Florida and throughout the Southeast, there were all these mounds of earth, as well as mounds of shell. And some of them were in large clusters that would, be in numbers of hundreds, right? In places like Ohio and Illinois. The largest of them all, Monk's Mound, east of St. Louis, the first city in North America, abandoned long before Europeans showed up, but in the 11th century AD, occupied by upwards of 50,000 people by a society known as the Mississippians, who were corn agriculturalists there. Well, throughout this entire history, there was this myth that the mounds of North America were not built by the ancestors of the living Indians of North America. They were built by a lost race of people. In some minds, it was a lost race of giants. In other minds, it was a lost tribe, the lost tribes of Israel, right? In some other minds, it was the Welsh, or it was some Native American people that was extinguished by the ancestors of the living Native North American peoples, right? It's known as the mound builder myth, and it was rampant throughout the 19th century, finally put to rest in 1894 by the Smithsonian Institution, a fledgling institution of the federal government, when John Wesley Powell allocated money to a guy named Cyrus Thomas, who was actually a lawyer, not an archaeologist, but he assembled a team of archaeologists to collect the data to prove once and for all that this incredible moundscape of North America was the work of the ancestors of the living Indians of the 19th century, right? This was a big breakthrough. And I think scholars throughout the world celebrated it. And I think the United States citizens were a little perplexed that this myth was busted. So there was this really horrible irony that once it was established that the mounds were the product of Native North American people, there was widespread destruction of them to get them out of the way because they were vestiges of these people that they've been trying for a long time to get rid of, right? So let's erase their past by erasing their material culture, by erasing evidence of their prior existence there. There also was looting. As you're seeing here on the left, that's the Spiro Mound in Oklahoma. During the Depression, a mining company about ready to go bankrupt figured out that they could mine artifacts and sell them on the black market. Well, actually, at that time, it wasn't a black market. It was an open market. There weren't any laws protecting it, right? And they made lots of money doing this, and by that, they saved their company and fed their employees and their families. So in one sense, they did what was necessary, and it was perfectly legal for them to do that. If they tried to do that today, they'd all end up in jail because this would be a huge violation of federal and state law. These, as you can see, there's bones piled up there, so they're digging through graves to get to these grave goods. And then here in Florida, there's Bluffton. It's one example of many that for the greater public good, the government systematically, well, I shouldn't say they systematically, the government allowed permits for the mining of earth and shell, primarily shell here in Florida, that was then used for construction. So if you go to Volusia County and rip up the asphalt of the county roads, you'll find a shell underneath it. And with the shell, you'll find human remains and you'll find artifacts and so forth, because these things were just loaded with all that, right? So that leads us to the 1990s and repatriation. The US government, since the Antiquities Act of the teens, the 19 teens, has been well aware of the need to preserve its past in material form. It's not enough just to have a past in documents, that there are monuments and landscapes and cemeteries and battlefields and so forth that are worth preserving in their own right because they do encapsulate these events in this history, right? Well, that's the case for Native North America before Europeans arrived. It's all non-literate. And so starting as early as the teens, there were forward-thinking politicians and citizens that said we should preserve things like Mesa Verde, right? We should not allow these things to be developed and destroyed because they're incredible resources. There's still a lot of people today that would turn their nose up at that or think that that's silly because why waste good land just because we're honoring an ancient past of another people? But over the decades, the federal government has done pretty good at building the apparatus for historic preservation. There's a lot of holes in it, but I'd say that especially in the 60s and 70s, and even Richard Nixon did pretty good with an executive order demanding that all federal agencies go out and inventory their properties for historic resources like this, right? Well, all this was churning along without Native American input, which seems kind of funny, but starting in 1990, or starting in the late 80s, there was a push among Native Hawaiians through Daniel Inouye, the late Senator Daniel Inouye, to develop legislation that would enable Native peoples to reclaim artifacts and particularly human remains from sites with which they had direct ancestry, okay? So this got actually expanded by Daniel Inouye to the entire nation. And it got passed in 1990 as what we call NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. How it works is quite simple. Any holdings that a federal agency has or any institution with federal licensing or funding, any holdings that they have of Native American remains must be inventoried and then posted in the Federal Register to enable federally recognized tribes to make claims for the repatriation of that material. Now, I know you all know about repatriation. This has been going on for decades now with regard to various nation states and other entities with respect to things like the British Museum or the Louvre or any of these other massive museums in Europe. And the same goes with Harvard and the Field Museum and the American Museum of Natural History in the US. With NAGPRA now, all federally recognized tribes, and there's 500 plus of them, have the opportunity to make claims for repatriation. Now, this went to a lot of litigation over the last few decades. And ultimately, what's happened through case material, and I'm not very familiar with the details, but I know what the outcome has been. There's been a shift away from interpreting the law as property law and interpreting the law as human rights law. And by interpreting the law as human rights law, there's been a shift in procedure in how this is implemented. Instead of demonstrating direct descendancy from individuals who were dug up, skeletons that were dug up from graves, in order to make a claim for repatriation, demonstrating direct descendancy, which is very difficult for any people to do, including people of European descent. Instead of that, all it requires now is a reasonable argument of geographical proximity. And that proximity doesn't have to be current. In other words, it doesn't have to be only in the Seminole land today, but any land that Seminoles ever occupied that can be demonstrated through their own oral history and then archaeology, right? So archaeologists are in the throes of this as well. On the left there, you're seeing a NAGPRA committee. They are made up of Native American representatives from the recognized tribes, and then are made up also of individuals who have scholarly contributions to make to the adjudication of these sort of decisions. In the center, you're seeing an example of why we needed NAGPRA, because there were repositories that not only had human skeletal remains, but put them on display as if they were, art objects. And, some of these things like in Dixon Mound in Illinois were pretty egregiously poorly maintained to the point where, the bones were falling apart and there was dirt and trash and stuff accumulating in cemeteries. Pretty egregious, right? The book on the right just came out and it's highly controversial, published by University Press of Florida. They almost got pushed to the point of taking it out of circulation. It's written by a bioarchaeologist and a lawyer who argue that NAGPRA is not about justice, it's about political ideology. And it's about basically Native Americans making claims for things for which they have no right to make claims. They also make the argument as scientists that knowledge for knowledge's sake is in everyone's interest. And if we can learn about the Native past to improve the human condition today across the board, then it would be a huge benefit to all people, right? Well, this is similar to the argument that Andrew Jackson might have made about Indian removal, right? That if you leave them there and assimilate them, that'd be great. But he didn't believe that was possible. He didn't think they had the capacity to be educated and to be Americanized. So the only recourse we had was to get them out of the way. Well, that's basically what they're arguing here. The only recourse we have for science to prevail is to get the Indians out of the way, that they have no right to basically determine how science will proceed in analyzing the remains of these Native American ancestors. I find that wildly indefensible myself, personally. Okay, we're almost there. This just came out last week, and I couldn't help, or a week before last, I couldn't help to include it. I was putting this talk together, and I was thinking, boy, we're barely scratching the surface here. But one of the hot topics today is, of course, climate change. I think it's an unfortunate term. Climate always changes. It's global warming, and the global warming has been accelerated by us. But it's global warming, that would have, may have happened in the long-term future under natural process, but it's here now, and we got to deal with it. So we can bemoan the fact that it's happening. We can also lay blame on things other than ourselves. But the reality is that we got consequences we got to deal with, right? Who's suffering the most consequences right now? We could say, that Miami Beach is, because they can no longer build big high-rise complexes on a barrier island. Boo-hoo, right? I really care about that. It was a stupid idea to begin with. Why did we ever think that it was a good idea to build a city on barrier islands, right? They're inherently unstable. But what we have here with Native America is people being pushed to vulnerable places that they normally would not have occupied. Under their own control and autonomy, they would choose places that were less vulnerable. Or more traditionally, they would not remain stationary in one place no matter what. They're seasonal primarily because they're taking advantage of seasonally available foods. In the case of Native North American peoples who are procuring things like bison or going after caribou, these are migratory species. They move with the species. In the case of people that take advantage of things like salmon, they're migratory species too, so they move with the species as they move up the rivers and so forth. So what we find now is that Native peoples being relocated to places of greater vulnerability are now suffering the frontline consequences of things like sea level rise and global warming. In the Arctic, it's really a matter of losing permafrost. losing land, and in places like the Louisiana Delta, literally being flooded out, right? So this is something we're going to hear a lot more about in the future. The federal government is involved, certainly is in negotiation for relocating and financing relocations like that. But we're really, no pun intended, looking at the tip of the iceberg here. This is going to go on for many decades to come. And so I will leave with some signs of hope, leave you with some signs of hope. And there is reason to be hopeful. I'm not usually an optimist. I'm more of a cynic and a pessimist, but I'm really, really excited that I've seen some developments in the last year or two that would suggest that the next century might be better for Native North America than the last couple have been, right? One of the things, of course, is that we're seeing a resurgence in Native activism. And the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016 was a great example of that. People got together of Sioux tribes and then a lot of well-wishers and a lot of supporters to occupy land adjacent to the pipeline, which was running on the northeast edge of a Sioux reservation. And obviously the water source there going under this lake that was feeding the aquifer, that was basically feeding the water or supplying the water for people on the res, was potentially going to be contaminated. They rightfully wanted to know, did the government do due diligence looking at environmental impacts? And the answer to that, according to the Supreme Court, was no. Or was it a local court? Maybe a local court. In any event, last year, they basically were told to reevaluate the environmental impacts. In the interim, another federal judge decided that the pipeline can continue to operate until they reach their decision on this. And I think Joe Biden's reluctant to shutter it because he just shuttered the Keystone XL pipeline. And I think he doesn't want to be seen, this is what I'm reading in the paper, doesn't want to be seen as just like a no Joe, no to everything, that he's willing to negotiate these sorts of things. Now, Native activism, of course, has a long history. We could go back to the time of early settler colonialism, but the high watermarks that we know and love so well, the Battle of Little Bighorn, that was an incredible feat of collaboration among Native tribes to reassert their dominance in a place where they had been, upended by the discovery of gold and the movement of settlers into the Black Hills of the Dakotas. The ghost dance of the late 1880s led to the massacre at Wounded Knee. That was an atrocious affront on the part of the federal government for people that were peacefully trying to exercise their right and promote their own interest. And then we have, many of you will remember the 60s and the late 60s, the American Indian movement started. Then we had the taking of Alcatraz in 1969, the commandeering of the Mayflower replica in 1970, the occupation of Mount Rushmore in 1971, the occupation of Wounded Knee, the place of the massacre in 1890, in 1973, which led to a couple of deaths and not a very satisfactory ending there. And you may remember Russell Means, who died recently, as the kind of a kingpin in that whole thing. So there's been these movements that are growing again, a new generation of activism. At the same time, with the change of administration, Bears Ears, for instance, in the upper right there, that's a place in southeast Utah that Obama declared as a national monument, and then Trump took it off the books, and now Joe Biden put it back on. So it's seesawed back and forth, but here we are where we need to be. This is sacred land, rightfully so, for not only the Pueblo people of the region, but the Navajo and Apache and other groups. And then Deb Haaland, this is really heartwarming to me that we have the first Native American secretary in federal government, Secretary of the Interior, who very much is in favor of looking at some of these land claims that have been made. Last year, the Supreme Court decided that half of Oklahoma was in fact in Indian reservation land, not for land reclamation, but for jurisdiction, so that any criminal activities, any criminal charges will be brought now to the federal level and not the state level. And this opens up a whole bunch of cases that could be retried, I suppose. So there is hope for this future. It ultimately is about the land. The people themselves have survived and thrived. Native peoples, of course, are not extinct. You might think that. There's a widespread belief that, the people that are native today are just, only remotely native. Perhaps they have 1/32nd identity. If we go to blood quantum, the federal government's always considered percentages. And I think the more typical thing is a 16th. If you have a 16th Indian blood, which means one great grandparent, then you are eligible for recognition as member of a federally recognized tribe. There's 500 and, I wrote it down somewhere, 500 and some federally recognized tribes today, 543, I think it is, something like that. 3 million members. And there's also, in addition to that, state recognized tribes with hundreds of thousands of other members. Native American peoples are a large number of our citizenry, and they certainly deserve all the rights and privileges that come with that. And I think that I hope before I kick the bucket, I'll see some more gains in that respect. So thank you for your time. I hope I've led off this series in a good way for you, something to think about. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. I know Phyllis. Hi, Phyllis.
You said that particularly in New England, that there was a distinguishment between use of the land and ownership of the land. My question is, did the Native Americans actually believe that anyone owned the land?
No. No, and it's hard to put into English terms. I think one of the things I've learned in interacting with, particularly this one Native American student who is an incredible scholar. He has a master's degree in divinity from Harvard University, and he's earning a PhD in ecology here at UF. Started a deliberate community in Alabama to resuscitate native approaches to land use. So they had to work within the system. So they bought land. They had to purchase land. They did it with donations. It cost several $1 million. It's a lot of land. They got a herd of buffalo there now. They're raising sturgeon and so forth. So what Marcus would say is that they've come to accept the fact that they work within this system of land ownership. That's the law of the land, and that's basically how you acquire land, protect land, and transfer land, right? Whether it's inheritance or buying and selling it. So I wouldn't say that Native American people today would eschew this idea of ownership because they have to work within a system. They do that well. And what Marcus would say is that we're not fools, right? We'll figure out how to work within the system to achieve our ends rather than, let's go to Washington and burn the place to the ground and we'll start all over again. The difference between use rights and property rights was of concern to Karl Marx. I mean, this is basically what he was all about and thinking about commodification. And so land becoming a commodity was alienating it from those who knew the land, grew up on the land, who see the land as their legacy and their heritage. And then from a Native point of view, it's really spiritual too, that it's Mother Earth, right? So the earth is not to be taken, it's to be husbanded, it's to be nurtured, and anything taken from it needs to be reciprocated, right? So we see a lot of Native, as an archaeologist, I find things in the ground that don't make sense from a practical point of view, that, an entire skeleton from a deer would be buried in a pit without being butchered. And it was like, well, geez, did they bury this because it was a pet? Is this the yearling? We're looking at a Native American version of Marjorie Kennan Rollins. No, what it is that they're giving back to Mother Earth that from which they've taken in order to replenish the next population of deer. This idea of reciprocity and balance is what really drives their actions. And we've lost that as people worldwide. And that's why we face all these consequences of basically diminishing resources. And God help us if we got to colonize Mars to survive as a species. I ain't going. But the use rights, it's a really interesting question. And I think that anthropologists do debate whether or not there was a sense of ownership, because we do see, I don't want to sugarcoat everything. We do see in the pre-Columbian past evidence of warfare. We see evidence of what might be called territorialism. We certainly see evidence of defense when we have palisades and parapets and stuff built into villages. We know that the Iroquois were fighting one another when the French showed up. We know that people of Sioux ancestry were at odds with one another in the Eastern Great Plains. So this isn't to say that Native North America was kumbaya land and everybody got along and went along. But the idea of property rights was probably novel to them. And that's why I think, you know, the early colonists in trying to negotiate treaties and so forth were speaking a language perhaps that just didn't translate. Even if you translate it into the native tongue, it didn't have equivalent concepts, right? So,
Time for a few more?
yeah, sure. Oh, take as many as I can
Shirley
get.
Bloodworth, go ahead.
I just wondered if you could tell us what the voting status is of the Indians. Are people campaign on where the Indians are? What is the status of that?
Well, they have voting rights now that all the rest of us do, and that's, you know, that ended up being, I think, in the last campaign, a little bit of an issue. Was Joe Biden or any other Democratic candidate spending enough time in Indian land? And I don't know the answer to that. I didn't follow the press on that. I do know that with, you know, the recent debates about changing voting laws in various states, that it'll disenfranchise Native people the way it'll disenfranchise people of lower income and people of color across the continent, right? And that is because in Native country like the Pine Ridge Reservation in the Dakotas, or many of the reservations in Oklahoma, it's a pretty long trek from one's home to a voting precinct station, right? So if you pass a law that says you must do in-person voting, you're probably cutting back on the number of participants who have to travel far, right? And so that's all I really know about it at this point. It's not an area that I've really delved into much, but it's a good question. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I think that's it. Well, we thank our Zoom
Hi,
audience
Brigida.
and our Oak Room audience. Any final comments?
Hi, Barbara.
Ken, thank you so much. Interesting, provocative presentation. Obviously, a lot of work went into it, but we appreciate it, and we appreciate your efforts and the efforts of your colleagues to put this course together. And I saw that Barbara was on the screen before. I don't know where
She's
she
right
went.
here.
Oh, she's still there.
Yeah.
Barbara was an integral part of putting this series together. You will hear from her in a couple of weeks. And her presentation will also be very provoking. So I hope you all have a good afternoon and you all come back and listen to the rest of the series. Thank you.
That was terrific.
Thank
really.
you. Thank you.